Commence primary ignition.
I'm just not the hero type, clearly.
What a piece of junk.
Enterprise, this is the captain.
I got a bad feeling about this.
It's all part of the plan.
Engage.
Welcome back to Podcast 2 for 1. I'm your host, Donovan Thompson, with my co-host,
Daniel Wingfield.
And today we're joined by none other than Dr. Bruce Hutchinson. Doctor?
I am so glad to be back once again. Thank you for the snaps.
Of course.
Yeah.
This is episode 149 as we celebrate the podcast leading into episode 150. We thought no better way to do it than to break down Avengers Endgame. So episode 149 will be part one, and then we'll finish with episode 150 with part two, Avengers Endgame. And we thought it's a long movie, and it'd be good to kind of break these two things up into two, decently sized episodes. So I'm excited to get into that. Bruce, what was the last movie that we broke down? Was it what was it? Was it The Prestige? What was this movie?
No. Well, did we do The Prestige after the Truman Show?
Oh, yeah, Truman Show.
Yes, we did.
I don't remember.
I think we did The Prestige after.
Okay.
Sure.
Then yeah,
Pretty
that might have been it.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. I'm glad
we were on a little hiatus.
Yeah,
some say.
It's been a little bit. We were going to do a Halloween show, and then we just all got too busy. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Well, if you didn't know, and I bet you didn't, we are sponsored by Kapow Comics, located at 4047 East Kill Avenue in Sherwood, Arkansas. There they have comic books, collectibles, graphic novels, and of course, special guest appearances throughout the year. Kapow. And if you haven't already, and let's be honest, you probably haven't, hit that subscribe button and notification bell on youtube.com/241studios, the best place to consume the content, of course, on all podcast services like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and more. All your love and support really helps us out. And of course, we'd like to keep doing this. We're going to do it whether you like it or not, but it would be nice to have your attention while we do it.
Yes.
All right, guys.
And maybe some of your money, just a little.
And maybe some of your money. Yeah.
Donovan, I have a question for you before we get started.
Sure.
Are you gonna trigger a DCMA takedown notification by whatever's playing on your TV in the background?
Oh,
I'm not. And what's playing is Avengers Endgame, so it's very appropriate.
Okay.
Well, does how much of the screen needs to be on there for the album?
I have no idea, but it just.
Because they have AI that will recognize that like you have a movie playing in the background and can get copyright strike. I mean, I don't.
Well, you guys can just put a little black bar.
It's not even half the screen, So
I would hope not. Yeah,
but I think we're okay.
Okay, good.
I think we'll be fine. I did it for moral support, and also I can see the reflection, so I can see scenes happening while I'm like, oh yeah, I did. You know what, Bruce? You'll be proud of me. I took notes. When I care about something, when I take notes. I took notes on Die Hard. I took notes on Infinity War. I took notes on this one. You always take notes. It's less impressive from you because you always take notes.
I am proud of you, Donovan. I am proud of you.
Thank you. That's all I wanted to
You're
hear,
welcome.
Let's get started, boys. So first off, I remember this is very similar to Infinity War. Avengers Endgame, the trailer dropped, and of course, this is the trailer dropped probably 6 to 8 months after Infinity War, and of course, where Infinity War left off, the Avengers had lost, Thanos had snapped half of the universe, and it was like I considered our generation's Empire Strikes Back. Right? We have the heroes don't necessarily win. In this case, they really don't win, and we're kind of left on the edge of our seat, like what's going to happen next, right? And there's at this point in the MCU, this is the 22nd movie in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So it's the culmination of, I think at that point, 11 years. Now we're coming up on Black Panther: Wakanda Forever was the 30th movie in the MCU, on top of like 7 or 8 Disney Plus TV shows. I know they're still going. I think I'll say this. I think ultimately Infinity War is a better made movie, but I think the catharsis that Endgame gives me is next to none. I've never cried so much than I have in watching Avengers Endgame. My contacts were like fucking up on me when I was watching the movie for the first time in the theater. And and there's just little moments I'll tell you that I was just like, I cried during this moment. I'll tell you as we go how many times I cried. But I watched it again a couple weeks back when we were prepping for this, and I haven't really watched it honestly since then because I was like, I'm just not ready to honestly feel all these emotions at the moment. And I watched it again. Of course, I cried some more, and I think it's it's an interesting movie, as we'll talk about, just for the nature of it being the culmination of so many different movies. You know, it's very similar to Infinity War in a lot of ways in that. But ultimately, I think this is the peak of the MCU. You know, me and Daniel have been talking a lot for the last couple of years since Endgame. There's been some highs like Spider-Man No Way Home, and other things like that. But ultimately, the MCU has really dropped off. And I didn't start saying that until about March or in May this year. And it hurt me the first time I said it, but now I got it out of my system to say it. So I can naturally accept that. But we're at lower quality in the MCU for the, you know, in my opinion, like overall for the first time. And it's a good movie. So give me your guys' initial impressions. Bruce, I want to start with you.
Yeah, I think it's a good movie. I mean, you know, like you said, it's the culmination of all of these movies. I think, you know, that's a really hard place to be, I think, for Marvel and the filmmakers in terms of like, how do you do a good movie but serve the fans, give them the cathartic moments, give them the emotional moments. It reminds me a little bit, I mean, it's a much different thing, but when Star Wars, Star Wars Force Awakens, was that the first of the new ones?
The new sequels, yeah.
Yeah, you know, and I think they had a similar challenge, is like, okay, we haven't had a Star Wars movie forever, and we've got to hit all these highlights and bring back these characters and make sure each person gets their moments, you know. And I think that this movie had to do a lot of that as well. And I think it does it pretty successfully. I mean, like you said, I think, or you alluded to, I think it's not perfect. You know, it has a few issues, and at times it does feel like a catalog, you know, where it's like, okay, we've got to hit this, and this, especially like the ending, you know, is a little bit like Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, you know, where it's just like, okay, we got one more thing. But yeah, at the same time, I think it hits those notes, and it kind of gives you the big climactic battle you want, and, you know, the final act. And, you know, I think for everything that it needed to do, it did it really well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is such an interesting movie just because of everything we've said, how much it had to carry in terms of plot, in terms of fan service, in terms of being the finale, not only to like a 2-movie saga, but also a 10-movie saga. And I think just like Infinity War, I think it does that pretty damn well. Like for all of the things that it has to accomplish, it doesn't do any of them poorly. It does them all pretty well. I think mainly, I think it's a little long in the tooth a little bit here and there. And then it's just, I wouldn't even say that it's a criticism as much as it's just an interesting film, even like analyzing it from like a protagonist and antagonist point of view, and how that works in the progression, and like because it is picking up right where we left off from a previous film, and because of how many characters could be technically a protagonist in this, like it's just different. It's playing by a different set of rules almost than every other movie, just because it's got different goals than these other movies, and it's got different systems to get there. And so, yeah, I think like you, Donovan, I think as just, if I'm analyzing it as a film and like how does it work structurally as a film, I think Infinity War is a better end-to-end film, like in terms of flow, in terms of pacing, and the emotional, where the emotional points hit, and it's just really tight to me. And then this one isn't as tight, but I don't know if it could have been as satisfying as it is. So yeah, I'm interested to dig into it with you guys.
Yeah, you know, it does have some, I was just gonna say real quickly to echo Daniel. It does have some interesting structural things to it. You know, and again, I wouldn't necessarily call them flaws, but they're things that at least normally when you're structuring a movie, I don't know that you necessarily see them in the way they play out here. So yeah, sorry, Donovan.
No, that's great. It's interesting. You know, when they first announced these 2 movies, it was Infinity War, Part 1 and Part 2. And so, you know, that to me, when they split movies like that, it's one big movie, right? I mean, it really is. You could literally just take out the credits after Infinity War and almost have like maybe a different one extra scene or something, but it could operate as one big 6-hour movie. So it is interesting in that fact that it really does pick up pretty much right after, a few weeks at least, right afterwards.
Well, I mean, with Tony in the thing in the very beginning, I mean, that's like hours or
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
I guess they have been floating a couple weeks. Sorry, I'm sorry.
Yeah. But no, let's get started into this. So the actual opening of the movie is with Hawkeye, right? And that's one thing that when we were going into this as fans, is we were like, "Where's Hawkeye in the trailer for Infinity War? And what is he doing?" The last time we saw him, he had kind of retired in Age of Ultron. But he was there for a little bit in Civil War to get arrested, and they ended up being broken out by Captain America, right? So we kind of felt he was with his family, and I think what a great way to catch up with an Avenger that is, on the boots on the ground, and someone who's just a regular citizen and a person, and seeing how your whole world can be taken away from you, just doing mundane, not saying mundane, but just doing family stuff, right? And how horrifying that is. And then also how that puts him on his path, his trajectory. And I think what a haunting opening, right? Because we didn't really get to see too much of the snap and how it affected the world at the end of Infinity War. We just basically how it affected the Avengers and their close companions, right? So I think that's just an amazing scene to open on, and it's just grim, and you're like, "Fuck," What do you guys think?
Yeah, I love the opening scene. I've always been a really big fan. I think you're right. It sets the tone. It picks up that kind of just dark, foreboding tone that Infinity War ends on very well, and I think. It's very grim, and I think the acting's pretty good. It all feels pretty like realistic and natural. Like it feels like a pretty real family, and I think just it's really short. I mean, it's like barely over a minute, but it's very effective, and I agree. It's a great opening scene.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. I agree.
Yeah. So right then we're basically picking up right with Tony, right? Tony and Nebula, and they're drifting through space. Tony kind of gives us a little bit of monologue. He's recording into his helmet, potentially if it ever reaches Pepper, kind of like a last will and testament sort of thing. And again, it's grim, it's depressing, but he still has that heart and that humor that Tony always gives us, in his dialogue. And it's also, it's weird too, because we're talking about this movie years after it's come out, and so we've had so many other projects now with so many other characters bouncing off each other, and so sometimes I kind of do want to also, as we go through this, talk about this was like a new interaction for the MCU, because we're not only talking about the movie, we're talking about the universe, right? So like pairing up Nebula and Tony together, I thought was a fun pairing, and it was fun to see someone who is cold and literally a robot, right, and calculated, paired up with Tony. And it's like you would never, I think, on a cool factor be like, oh, I want them two to be teamed up. It was just kind of like, oh, this is a weird pairing, but it's sweet and fun, and it works. And obviously we get into Carol Danvers showing up as Captain Marvel, this was actually the first thing she shot before Captain Marvel came out in theaters. And yeah. I mean, Tony ends up landing back on Earth with the Avengers.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of have to have a character through which we kind of return to the rest of the characters. And even though, like you guys pointed out, we start with Hawkeye, it makes sense. I mean, if there is a protagonist to the Avengers in the end, it probably is Tony. I mean, obviously, you could make an argument for Captain America also. They're sort of the twin pillars, are probably the two main ones, and then you might have Thor sort of right behind them. But in a lot of ways, they were always the leaders of the Avengers. They were the ones on the opposite sides of the Civil War. So it makes sense that you're gonna kind of bring us back into the story with one of those two guys. And it happens to be Tony.
Yeah. And then that leads right into them picking him up at the football field with Captain Marvel dropping him off, and then we get this heartbreaking scene between it's basically all the things that they wanted to say to each other after and during Civil War, and then during this hiatus between them breaking up as the Avengers. And it's heartbreaking. Tony says, "You said we would, I said we'd lose, and you said we'd do it together." And which that was all the way back in Avengers Age of Ultron, right? So I love it when they're always pulling back little things like that. Yeah. So he says that Tony looks horrible. It's like a mess. And he takes off his heart piece, and he gives it to him and says, you go out there and you take care of him, and, you run and hide, and it really shook up Tony. And just seeing how this friendship has crumbled even further, because not only is half the world gone, that's obviously big, but just on a personal level, Tony watched Peter Parker die in his arms, you know, and then Tony watched Bucky die and Sam die and everyone else die, and or Steve watched. So
Yeah.
it's just, I feel like everyone brings their A game in the acting in this film.
I agree completely.
Yeah, I will bring up one of my little pet peeves, and it's something that's just, I think you can't avoid with the MCU, and that is, of course, sort of how they have to deal with Captain Marvel, and it's sort of like,
Sure.
there's other planets that needed me, I mean, because in the end we know that Captain Marvel is so insanely powerful that we always have to have sort of these kind of lame excuses for why she has to run off and go do something else, but that's fine. I mean, that's a very small thing, and we move on. But
I mean, it's one of those things. You're not wrong. It's especially after Avengers 1 happened, it was always kind of like, how are they going to do any type of threat without one of the other people? And you kind of saw through phase 2 that everyone is almost disconnected from the other ones through, like, Cap is, a spy thriller. Who does he trust? Tony literally has his armor taken away. Who can he call? They were kind of trying to be clever with it in some level, but there's obviously going to be issues every time you do this, So it's not an easy one to solve for sure.
Yeah.
But I think what's really great here is that after they get the information from Tony and they kind of, what little they have from him, they end up going and they learn that potentially Thanos has snapped again, right? It emits a certain type of radiation, ironically, or not ironically. It's like, again, manifest destiny almost. It's like gamma radiation. So Bruce knows to track it because it's what he's about. It's how the Hulk was created. So they, all decide to go take the fight to Thanos. They have Captain Marvel with them this time. And I'll tell you, this is the first time I cried in the movie, was when it's a close-up shot of Captain America's eye whenever he's in space. Like when he sees the space kind of like whizzing by him like light speed, I started like losing it. I was like the journey we've been on with these characters, like Tony was in the 40s, Cap was in the 40s, and just a boy wanting to fight in the war. Now he's in space going to fight aliens. I was just getting emotional watching that scene. So, but getting them there, obviously, to I can't think of the name of the planet, but they get him down there, and Thanos kind of reveals, like, no, this was, temptation, right? Like, having the stones is temptation, and even for myself. And so I used the stones to get rid of the stones. I broke them down to atoms, so to speak, which would make it almost virtually impossible to use them again to bring everybody back. And from there, of course, we get the classic Thor just lops off Thanos's head, and he says, "I went for the head." Right. So clearly he's dealing with some PTSD from Infinity War, and he feels tremendous remorse and regret for not doing, exactly. He's paying for what Bruce didn't like. Infinity War.
Right.
Yeah. So he clearly fucked up, and he's feeling the problem for that. And then what's interesting is that I was
gonna say, if I recall, Nebula is there, right?
Yeah,
she is, and there's they basically
sort of Thor lops Nebula's father's head off without even batting an eye.
Didn't care. Thor's so powerful, it's like even try to do something, but no, there was something interesting too there. That little conversation, Nebula and Thanos is kind of like, he's not lying. Do you ever consider me a liar? And she's like, no, or whatever, So that's interesting tidbit for later too. But what's really interesting here is that we cut to 5 years later, and we get, the Statue of Liberty. We get this like almost David Fincher like aesthetic in terms of like color palette, and Captain America running, we have to move on group. And I think it's pretty powerful to cut 5 years later. Like, Thanos won for a good amount of time here, against the whole universe.
Yeah, I'm interested how you guys kind of classify that opening, I guess, sequence, the first kind of 18, 19, 20 minutes before this.
That's right at 20 minutes, yeah. Because
theoretically, I guess it is Act 1, but in terms of like what you typically get from an Act 1, which is like setting, what is the what is the norm? You know,
inciting incident.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, but even just setting what is the norm that the inciting incident changes, right? That's usually like the first 20 minutes. And I mean, I obviously I think Ant-Man waking up is the inciting incident probably of the whole movie, but we get basically like 3 or 4 minutes of the normal before we get the incident that changes. So Bruce, did you count that 18 minutes as like act one, like an extended opening, or like?
So yeah, this actually took me, like, I watched it and I took all these notes and I sort of did an initial sort of structural breakdown, and it didn't quite make sense. And I was like, this is really weird. So I kind of like, I waited, and then closer to when we were doing it today, I went through again and sort of figured it out more closely. And initially I'd had that first 20 minutes up till Thor kills Thanos as one sequence. But I ended up deciding that it was two sequences, and sort of did the first 10 minutes up till Tony returning as one sequence, and then did sort of the second sequence of them sort of tracking signals and then going and killing Thanos as a second sequence. And then I ended up doing Scott returning and proposing quantum time travel. And then sort of, okay, we got to talk to Tony as, the end of act one. So, we sort of have like, a third sequence and the end of act one, so that we were like, okay, the end of act one is we now have a plan. Right. But I agree with you. Yeah, I agree with you, Daniel, that it is weird because the first 20 minutes, in a weird way, I don't want to say it's not doing anything, but it's like it's filled with big things that aren't really meaningful in a way. Like Tony is gone and he comes back and then he says, sorry, you're on your own, which is only going to last for 10 or 15 minutes, and then he's going to come back. And then Thor kills Thanos, but it doesn't matter, right? I mean, killing Thanos is purely cathartic for Thor. It doesn't change really anything.
It's really all character moments. It's all these character moments that are big for these characters, but they don't have any consequences to them that are direct, at least.
Which again, I think gets to what you were saying about what Donovan, you were saying about this really being like the second half of a much longer film, So it almost reminds me of like if you were watching Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring, and then you sat down, 2 years later and started watching The Two Towers. You just kind of go into it, and we've got these characters who are pursuing their friend, who are pursuing the hobbits have been kidnapped and they're going after them, and we're just right in it, and this feels sort of similar in the sense it's like, we have these 20 minutes, but they're doing sort of character work, but they're not really doing much plot work, Right. As you said, Daniel, the plot doesn't really get started until Scott shows up, right? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the first thing that actually starts the ball rolling. And that's what 20 to 25 minutes into the movie, which is a little late. I mean, there are movies that do that, but it's unusual for sure.
Well, but it's also a 3 hour and 4 minute movie though, too. Sorry, Daniel. Typically it starts at minute 10 or 11. It's like a 2 hour movie. This starts at, minute 25, 26, or I guess he comes back at like 23, 24. He meets Cassie at 26. So it's like, I'm not saying anyone's wrong. I'm just saying like it's a little extended. It's also a long ass movie too.
Well, it's just looking at.
Sorry, Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just looking at, because I was trying to kind of really look at like how are goals changing throughout these acts as well, and in some ways they almost. I mean, you could look at it as like from the very first I guess from sequence 2, their goal is to go get the stones and snap everyone back, and that doesn't actually change at a broad level till the end of the movie. That's what they end up doing.
Yeah.
But even specifically, like what's interesting is like, I mean, the there is no goal until the inciting incident. It creates the goal. And I feel like sometimes a lot of times what the characters want before, and I guess we kind of do, but it's like this thing of like the goal becomes then to figure out time travel. And then once you figured out time travel, then they have to make a plan to make it work. So it is just at a goal level, it's interesting because the goal doesn't change that much, only as much as in like, I guess maybe
it's
like
very much pieces. It's I mean, it's and I mean, and I don't think that's atypical. I mean, it depends on the movie, but you can have. I mean, a lot of movies, we don't know what the movie level goal is until later in the movie. But I
Sure.
think we have a pretty good sense, and I think most of the audience would have known going in that they're going to try to reverse what Thanos had done
absolutely.
in some form or fashion. And so, I think we know that even before the inciting incident. We just don't know how they're going to do it, right? Like,
Right.
clearly they're going to want to do this. And even, in that second sequence, when they're sort of tracking the radiation, we already have Natasha sort of, just on the lookout for anything Thanos, any kind of signals that might, so we know even then that they want to be able to, or at least some of them want to be able to do something. It's just that, we have to know what the mechanism is going to be, which, like we were saying, that's all plot, right? It's just like, what will be the plot device that will allow them to try to make this happen.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think one thing to point out too is how maybe there's only one area I think it's not a good thing, which we'll get to in a little bit very soon. But I think it was a smart thing on the writers to kind of do this opening sequence and then have the 5 years later, because everyone, I mean, again, if you're watching this pod and you weren't there when it was happening, or you're listening to this pod 10 years from now, the memes and the speculation and the articles and the amount of like mystery
Theories,
and everything else after Infinity War, after those credits rolled, was off the charts. Like the amount of buzz on the internet was crazy. It was wild. It's like all you could see was Infinity War. It's all everybody was talking about. I mean, it made a fuck ton of money. Both of them did. And I think opening with all those big character moments, and then also like killing Thanos, there was a part of me that was like, is Thanos even the bad guy in the movie? Is there some other bad guy that we don't know about? You know what I mean? Like, I think it's smart to kind of take that away from you in the beginning, and then even kind of take away the idea of the Infinity Stones. There's always the possibility of time travel and those kind of things, but unless you were sitting there just like absolutely going into like the dark web. Not even the dark web, the deep
Not even that.
Of the web.
A couple certain subreddits on Reddit. That's not even the
and looking at plot leaks like that come out like a week or two before the movie dropped. Unless you were doing that and really trying to spoil it for yourself, no one really knew what the movie is about. The trailers are all like pieces of other films, and also Marvel lies to us throughout. We know this from Infinity War, right? Hulk's never in Wakanda, So I think it was a smart play to do that, to kind of almost like clear the table and be like, you don't know what the movie is yet. We did know, and it was that movie, but there was like a small period where we're like, oh, what is the movie we're fixing to watch?
I think there's two other things too that contribute to that. One is, this isn't a movie that has to win the audience in the first 10 minutes. You always hear like, your first 10 minutes, you got to win the audience over. That wasn't going to be an issue. I mean, no one, Marvel knew that they could take their time. And two, whenever it was, however it happened, that they decided that Scott was going to hold the key to how they could fix things. I don't think you can start the first 10 minutes of this movie with Scott. You know what I mean? I mean, he's not a big enough character. You have to revisit our major characters first. And so I do think it was smart to sort of hit those characters and get the big three, and then get sort of our big secondary characters of Hulk and Natasha, and and then we can hit kind of our almost third level characters of Ant-Man, who in kind of an irony is going to be the one who has the solution, the most clueless Avenger of them all, right?
Which a great humor is derived from, which we'll get to. But we can't forget the biggest hero, the unsung hero of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the rat that pushes the button, Bruce. Yeah, the rat that pushes the button out loud.
That is the only. That was like, I mean, I get that like every movie has convenience in it, but I will say like, and I quickly got over it, but I was like, I rolled my eyes a little bit at that because it's just.
Well, the way I look at it is, Doctor Strange, we had to do this plan. That way this one rat will press the button. He saw all the variations.
There was many other versions where everything went right except the rat, but this was the only one that had the rat. Yeah.
Well, and the rat is just fun because it's one of those plot things that really doesn't matter, because they could have come up with something else. It's been so many years, the storage unit's being emptied, someone buys the unit, gets the van, Wonder what this button does. I mean,
In fact, you could
Sure.
imagine that being a Stan Lee cameo if he had been alive at the time.
Oh yeah.
sure, yeah.
Well, he was alive at the time. He
Oh, okay.
shot. He's in the movie. We'll get to him.
He's in the
eventually.
flashback. I thought he had already passed away by that point. Maybe not. Okay.
Well, he still recorded for the movie.
Yeah, but by the time it came out, I thought he had. But maybe I'm wrong.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean,
Um,
the last thing I'll say about this first act is it does bum me a little bit that time travel is the solution. Time travel is a pet peeve for me. It just has become such a convenient thing for so many franchises to go back to. But again, I mean,
It's
there's
a
got to
weird
be
thing.
something,
the opposite.
I couldn't think of a better way to. It's almost like they were put in this impossible situation where it was either going to be like different dimensions or time travel. And honestly, for an audience, we're getting to the dimensional stuff now, but they had to
exactly
ease us into this shit. I almost feel like because like I mean like by the amount of Back to the Future references and every other time thing. I mean like they literally rattle off every time travel related medium they can think of.
They do
And
try to
it's really
push
fun.
back on that cliche,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
By referencing all those other movies, which was,
And I did enjoy
I think,
that.
clever of them to do.
Yes.
Yeah.
You mean Back to the Future is a bunch of bullshit? Like that's
Right.
well, see, I Back to the Future. It almost most of my life has always been fighting for my favorite movie of all time. So I
Sure.
welcome time travel if it's done correctly. And obviously, it's it's just made up bullshit, as Scott just said. So I
Right.
mean, it's just but part of it is it's just a mechanism to give us a ride. And the big thing that I think we'll see throughout the movie is it allows us to celebrate the MCU as we also close this chapter.
Sure.
That's the big. That's the big thing, and it's like a fun way to use it to also let us look back and then also pave the way for the future.
I agree
So
with that. Yeah.
So like we said, real quick, he arrives through the portal. He meets his daughter Cassie. Finds out the whole world has changed. We catch up with the Avengers compound with Nat, and talking with Captain Marvel, with Bruce, with Rhodey, all these people, and it's kind of like we're kind of monitoring the universe as it goes, right? Okoye is doing Wakanda because Chadwick is gone, and we pick up from there with Tony I keep saying Tony, with Cap and Steve and Nat, and they have their everyone moves on, but we don't. Like we're the ones. We're heroes that we have a greater calling kind of thing, and we're the ones who get to walk away. And then of course Ant-Man arrives and he proposes, hey, time travel. And so then we pick up with Tony 32 minutes into the movie, and we get an opening scene between Tony and now his daughter. And we see that in the 5 years, him and Pepper have settled down. He has a quaint little cabin out in the woods, the opposite of the tech genius that we've come to know. And now he has a daughter. It's pretty. I mean, it's pretty great. I mean, Cap shows up and they kind of propose with Scott. Time travel. Of course, Tony says, "Hey, even if it was possible, I can't lose what I've gained now. Like I somehow come out on the other end of it with a family, with a daughter, and if even that was possible, it could potentially destroy everything I have now, and I can't risk that. So like." Finally, anyway, it's some interesting stuff from the Tony that we saw. And I think everyone who listens to the podcast and people who watch the MCU, the whole first 3 phases, the first 10 years is Steve and Tony, and is watching their trajectories cross paths, and they end up becoming the other person by the end of the movie. And, which is amazing how they end up pulling that off, which we'll talk about more later. But yeah. And I think there's not a whole, it's really just plot here, right? I mean, it's really just them talking, hey, can you do this? I can't do this. And I think it's around, Cap, Nat, time travel. Tony figures out time travel, right? By himself.
Yeah, I was wondering, Bruce, you put the end of the act when Tony shows up to agree to help. Is that what you were saying? You put kind of
No, I put the end of the act when Scott's like, here's a solution, time travel.
Okay.
And so so then I put basically what Donovan's recapping as the 4th sequence. The first sequence of Act 2 is Tony saying time travel can't be done, then solving time travel immediately, and then going to Avengers headquarters and saying, here's time travel, right?
So
I
act,
sort of
act
put
two
that
is
as,
essentially figuring out the mechanics of how they're. Oh, my light died. Figuring out the mechanics of if Act One, the end of the goal, they figure out what to do. Act Two is figuring out how to do it, essentially, right?
yeah. And just to give an overview, if we want sort of a direction for the next, little bit of, so I put that as sequence 4. Sequence 5, I put reassembling the team, which is primarily getting Thor and Hawkeye, I think, are the two big things that they do to make that happen. So I put that as sequence 5. At 57 minutes, basically, everyone is now back, is reassembled. And then sequence 6 is preparing for time travel. And to me, the end of sequence 6 and then the end of Act 2 is, they're all standing in the circle. They activate the quantum device, and they all get sucked in, and boom, end of Act 2.
Yeah, and that's the first hour. That's the first hour and 5 minutes of the movie right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think you're right too. I think that's a pretty easy and good break. We have about 10, 15 more minutes here, so let's kind of recap that first or that second act here. So I know that Tony, we get a sweet thing with his daughter, I love you 3000, which obviously will pay off later. Is also a huge thing just in the pop culture zeitgeist. And a big question that Pepper asked Tony is, he's like, I had the ability to do it, I could maybe do a lot of good, and he's kind of like, but I don't want to lose what we lost. And he's like, I'm not going to do it. And she says, well, will you rest? Will you get the rest that will you be able to sleep tonight knowing that you could save all these people? Will you rest? Which is a big, which obviously has huge implications later. So we start minute 40, or go ahead.
Well, just go ahead on that. I think that to me is probably the biggest reason why I think Tony is probably the protagonist of this movie, while Cap is maybe the protagonist of the Infinity arc. Almost, you might say, being almost the very first Avenger as well, like chronologically. But like Tony in this movie has a change of heart, right? Like he goes through an arc in this. I don't know if Cap does. It'll be interesting to talk when we get to the final episode. But in terms of where Cap starts, he's kind of the same way throughout. But if you went back to maybe Age of Ultron and then Civil War, you could say maybe the what we get in the final and in the movie with Cap could be maybe the Cap to that. I don't know. I've enjoyed trying to kind of just analyze how this movie is using protagonists and like in the way that it is.
I will disagree a little bit. I don't think the Tony we see at the beginning, maybe like the space part, yes, but like I consider that kind of almost like leftovers from Infinity War, really. But I mean, I feel like Tony, I don't know.
Even just to say in the beginning, he said no. You know what I mean? He was not on board.
Sure.
I mean, even at that level, even
if he doesn't change, I pick up what you're saying, Daniel, because I think there's a couple of things going on here. One is I think that one of the things that began to happen with the Marvel movies that I think was maybe starting to get criticized. I know I was criticizing it, like in some of my classes, it would come up, which is that there weren't a lot of times a lot of personal stakes for the story, for the characters. I mean, when you watch the first Avengers movie, I mean, yes, they could die, but that never really seems to, it's sort of like, well, if they lose, what did they lose personally? And you never really feel anything, I mean, it's not to say that we don't get to know them a little personally, but there's not really like an internal goal. There's nothing that they're risking.
Yes.
There's no personal stakes. The stakes are all global and universal and saving millions and millions of people. And you never feel like any of them is going to lose something. It seems like, and even, I think they started moving in that direction, but even with Ultron and Infinity War, I don't know that we get a lot of that. And so here in Endgame, I feel like suddenly they're sort of like, we want to give them something to lose. We want to give them something that they care about. And we see that with some of the other characters too, like Hawkeye right from the start, But I think Tony embodies it the most, and so, spoiler alert, if we're going to kill Tony at the end, part of making it more moving is showing what he's losing what he's
Yes.
sacrificing and what he wanted to keep hold of. And so even if he doesn't change, I do think he has an internal goal, which is to be with his family, right? And so he has to sacrifice his internal goal in order to pursue the greater good external goal, right? And of course, he hopes he's not sacrificing, and Pepper hopes he's not sacrificing it, but of course he is, and we see where that goes, right? And so I think without that 10 minutes or so, or those couple of scenes where he turns his back on the Avengers and doesn't want to get involved and then finally does, is we're setting up something for him to lose, which is going to make the ending, I think, much more emotionally resonant than it would have been otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think even just to say that I think these two movies, Infinity War and Endgame, do a pretty dang good job of keeping the stakes feeling personal, even if they are still global at all times. Like even in Infinity War with Peter and Tony, that feels like of course we lost half of everyone, but Peter losing Tony in his arms hurt worse than knowing half the world's dead. You know what I mean? And like, you know, and in the same way here, I think it was a brilliant idea to give Tony something that he didn't want to change. I think that was just makes him more interesting and all that. But yeah, I think that's a good point that you made, Bruce. Yeah.
I also think it covers over sort of weak external plotting at that point. And I say weak in the sense like, okay, so they need to invent time travel and Tony has to invent time travel. I mean, what are you going to do with that? You know, you can either spend a whole sequence or act on time travel, which is just going to be dumb, you know, or you can kind of have him solve it in one, you know, quick scene, which of course is a little silly, but I think you know, the way they structure it isn't so much that whether Tony can solve time travel. It's almost like, well, of course Tony can solve time travel. Yeah. It's more, will he or does he want to solve time travel? And so I think that's actually pretty clever because, you know, otherwise, if you just focused it sort of on plot, like him actually doing it, it would just be a bunch of mumbo jumbo and then he would eventually solve it. And we wouldn't care, you know, it wouldn't matter. So I think I sort of like that they take it for granted, you know, it feels cheap, but it actually works, right? It's like, he's just going to mess around and solve it in an evening. And it's more about him wanting to do it or not. And then whether he will share the results with the Avengers and overcome his dispute with them, you know. And so I think that was clever. I think that was a smart way to do it.
No, I think it's very charming, and also it led us right into you know, his daughter, you know, another encounter with her, and it's literally he's reminded immediately of what he's going to lose after he just solved time travel. That was, you know, like
he says holy shit, and she's like right there. It's a great
yeah.
I mean, it's literally both outcomes are bumping into each other immediately, you know, or both, you know, choices. I might push back a little bit on the Avengers, like they're not having any internal goals. I mean, yes and no. It'd be a longer podcast if we kind of really break down a lot of the things going throughout the MCU, but it is weird because Steve, for the most part, he's already lost everything by the time first Avenger kicks in. The only thing he really has to lose left is Bucky after Bucky comes back. Or, you know, he finds Bucky and Winter Soldier, but also it's like he has, you know, the fear of losing who he is or who he thought he was in the world, you know? And so it's a different type of, you know, stakes for him in terms of like, he doesn't have ever relationships, you know, like he don't have a Pepper, that kind of thing, which is, he always is reminded of Peggy throughout the series, and that comes into play later. It is really interesting though. You know, we can talk about it a little bit more later. And Tony, the only thing he really had that grounded him that he could lose was Pepper. You know, from Iron Man 1 to until he gets a daughter, he could physically lose Pepper other than his own life and the other people's lives, right?
And of course,
I see what you're saying. I agree with you. On some level.
Well, yeah, and you're right. I mean, obviously, we can go to other MCU movies. You know, we can go to Thor and see that in some of the Thor movies, you know, I mean, he has issues with his father and he has issues with his brother, and, you know, and when Valhalla or whatever is destroyed, you know, I mean, things happen and they lose things for sure. But even then, the movies don't, I think, spend a lot of time just on personal things, you know what I mean? There might be a scene here or a scene here, but we've already had like multiple scenes with Tony. And then I think it's interesting, sequence 5, where we have to reassemble the team. You know, it's about going and finding, I mean, they go and get, I guess, Hulk. Is this where they go get Hulk and he's signing autographs, or is Hulk already?
When that's right after
Hulk was-
Tony says no.
Yeah, that was after, which is my actual only big problem with the 5-year gap, is that Hulk is kind of done dirty in Infinity War and in Endgame by the end of all this, because it's like,
Yeah,
you
his
know,
arc takes
beginning-
place off screen.
yeah, I mean, we get the big thing, you know, seeing Tony with the kid, that's a cool, fun surprise. We'll get to Thor here in a second, but then like Hulk and like his biggest character thing ever is like battling the Hulk, and he does that off camera,
Right.
and that's
Well,
a huge no-no.
I
my
agree
opinion.
too that like if you look at what this first 2 acts set up in terms of like mini arcs too with some of the side characters, the original Avengers all have really wonderfully set up like personal arcs set up, right? Like Hawkeye with being the Ronin, and how will he deal with who he's become since these steps. You've got Black Widow and like losing the only thing she's ever known of a family, and how will she react, and then obviously that pays off in a really meaningful way later. You've got Thor set up in a very like depressed state, and that has a big payoff later in multiple ways. And of course, obviously Tony and Cap, but then Hulk has nothing really to set up the pays off. Nothing pays off. Like he's just as is for the rest of the thing. I agree, that is, especially when you look at it, like they did every other original Avenger like that and just left him out. It kind of feels like maybe there was some scheduling issues that forced their hand or something, because I just don't understand that.
I mean, I think the thing was it's that 5-year gap, and they wanted everyone to be like, oh crap, this is like so weird and interesting that we have Smart Hulk now, and like it's like this thing that catch you by surprise. But I think that it just robs you of his arc, is what I think at the end of the day.
Well,
like
he doesn't.
It
I would say he
him.
doesn't have an arc in this movie. He's just
I think it would have been hard to fit in too, you know, because you know, in a sense, what you're saying, Daniel, and fits well, is like, you know, after we sort of get this stuff with Tony, you know, earlier, like in sequence 2 or end of 1, 2, whatever, and then in sequence 4, sequence 5 is like you said. I mean, it's primarily about going and getting Thor and going and getting Hawkeye, both of whom are suffering because of the losses that they've experienced from Infinity War, right? Hulk's thing doesn't fit into that, you know. So I think 2 things going on. One, I think is seeing what happens with those other 2 characters is reinforcing the idea that we're developing a little more personal stakes for other characters, so that we have more that characters can gain or can lose. But also, I mean, it just seems like hard. Like, how would you have fit the Hulk in, going back to his lab and, you know, whatever,
that's a
combining
good
his
point,
personality, like it just wouldn't fit in. Whereas the other ones all are related to what happened with.
That's a really good point.
Infinity War.
About
I don't know how you do that with Hulk. His is just different, you know.
It would
you
have
almost needed another Hulk movie. We needed a Hulk movie.
It would have been almost like a comedy sequence. Honestly,
I just thought of it.
Like it would have been lighter. It would have been used as like comic relief instead of it being like a serious thing. Probably, if they,
which it kind of is anyway. Yeah,
exactly.
You know what would have been amazing? You know what would have been amazing? I just thought of this. Now, this is why Marvel should hire me. I haven't heard anyone.
Reason number 56.
Yeah, I haven't heard anyone say this. When Thanos snapped, he should have snapped away the Hulk personality or the Bruce personality. They should have snapped one of them away.
I fixed it by saying there should have just been a Hulk solo movie in between Infinity War and Endgame,
you know, Daniel,
that would have been the fixer.
This is my moment.
They should hire me.
So anyway, I think that would have been interesting too. Is like his arc is trying to get back to the thing that he hasn't been wanting this entire time to save everybody. So anyway,
interesting. I like that.
Hey, not bad for just on the fly. Anyway, but you know, I will say, I mean, it is interesting. Well, we're fixing to have to wrap this pod up before we get into our episode 150. But real quick before we do that, let's talk about this scene. Tony showing up with the shield, right? So we know Civil War ended with Cap dropping the shield. He said that my father made that shield and that you don't deserve it, right? And so that was a big thing in the MCU is Cap versus him. Obviously, Cap knew that Bucky had killed his parents and decided to withhold that information from Tony, and it caused that rift that ended up causing. Or, you could argue, I think the thesis is that obviously if they were together in Avengers, they could have maybe potentially, or Infinity War, they could have beat Thanos, but because of that division, they couldn't do it because they weren't together. So I think a great moment, Tony showing up, and he handed him the shot in, bring one for everybody. He's like, "Are you sure?" And he's like, "Yeah, he made it for you." And it's something. It always kind of felt like Tony was jealous. He even says it. It's that thing that he was jealous of Steve because you're all my dad talked about. And there's always this weird relationship he's had with his father. They tried to do something with that in Iron Man 2. It didn't really pan out as well as they probably hoped for that movie. But it's always something there, right? His dad issues. I think it's a great thing. And also, we got to talk about the helicarrier blowing Scott Lang's tacos out of his taco holder. Pretty incredible.
Also, I just love that music. Honestly, there's something, I don't know, you may not like this, but Hulk is like so precious riding in the back of that truck while that like folk music is playing, and they're just like riding into what looks like a Nordic countryside or like bay or something. It's great. And I do think I really, Chris Hemsworth and Thor have had a hit and miss, kind of history, but I really enjoyed his portrayal of depressed Thor. I thought that worked really well, and I think I really liked his arc that kind of happens in the second half. But
I think the ultimate thesis of like the movie actually kind of lives with Thor. Actually, it's like, what does it mean to be a hero? And I think that kind of lives with Thor a lot, and also it's like almost like what are your you're trying to fit like a square through a peg hole kind of thing, and it's what does that mean for each individual too? What is a hero for each individual? Not just what is a hero, but like how are you a hero? Then how are you a hero? And what's your sunset look like? Like it's different for all three of our characters. Let's Daniel. We go to New Asgard, right? New Master 69. We see Korg there. And Thor, obviously they call him, Fat Thor, right? And so he's depressed and he's, hasn't taken care of himself. And I think it's beautiful whenever, Hulk is like, you helped me, just in, talking about Thor Ragnarok, you helped me through a hard time, that's why I'm here for you now too. And just Chris Hemsworth, even through, the ridiculousness of wearing a fat suit and everything else, walking around with a big belly. You can tell it even looks rubber, but it's like he still manages to sell the scene and the emotion of it, and like all the pain he's going through. I think it's great. Yeah. And bringing Rocket also great.
Yeah, it's also a nice combination of being able to take the humor, that they developed in Ragnarok and sort of have Thor as more of a comic character, which I think was really genius from that movie. And be able to hold on to that, but have it be justified within this more serious, so, okay.
Agreed.
Yeah, you give him this serious depressive thing, but you can play it for laughs. And it sort of allows you to straddle both kind of tonal aspects of what Thor brings you as a character.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Agreed.
I still stand by, and I even Love and Thunder definitely proved this, but best Thor is Infinity War Thor, 100%. And then they did a little bit more to the comedy with Endgame, but you're right, Bruce. I think it's justified in the context of kind of what's happening to him. So I think it's a good spot to stop, and then we'll pick up with Ronan, with Clint Barton, aka Hawkeye. So Daniel, how can our listeners write into us?
Listeners, you can write into bit.ly/2for1mail. Let us know what you thought of the first 3/7 of Endgame. bit.ly/2for1mail.
And if you can't ever bit, you can always go to youtube.com/2for1studios, the best place to consume content. There we have 2for1 Backflash, 2for1 Collectors, and of course, weekly podcast episodes. A lot of stuff on there. Give us a like and a subscribe, and you really help us out. Bruce, thank you so much for being on this episode. Of course, we are going to continue recording, but viewers, you have to wait for one whole week before you get episode 150 of podcast 2for1. Bruce, how can our listeners find the cool things that you do?
They can find me at BD Hutch on Instagram, and they can also find me at thehutchfiles.com, where I post a lot of my breakdowns that we discuss on the podcast, as well as others.
Awesome, guys. I will see you in literally less than 10 seconds. And thank you for being on here, Bruce. My name is Donovan Thompson.
I'm Daniel Wingfield.
I'm Bruce Hutchinson.
And we have spoken.